The mountain trembles as furious men storm Elias's cabin, Eliza screaming in pain. "He's sterile. This can't be his child," a villager shouts, challenging Elias's very existence. His deepest fear, a false diagnosis, now reverberates through the valley as Eliza labors. What happens next defies all logic, proving the wild holds truths the city never knew. Whispers from the distant settlements, carried on gusts of wind that rarely reached his secluded eyrie, painted him as a giant among men, a hunter whose instincts were as sharp and ancient as the peaks he called home. They spoke of his impenetrable silence, his eyes that held the wisdom and the sorrow of countless seasons, reflecting the rugged beauty and brutal honesty of the land. The crisp mountain air, sharp with the scent of pine needles and damp earth, filled his lungs with each powerful breath, a constant reminder of his primal existence. The rhythmic swing of his axe against seasoned timber echoed through the profound silence, a solitary beat in the heart of the wild. Smoke thick and fragrant from his stone hearth curled skyward, a beacon visible only to the keenest eye, hinting at the singular warmth within his remote dwelling. His days were a ceaseless dance with the elements, tracking deer through powdery snow, mending traps near icy streams, preparing pelts whose coarse texture against his hands was a familiar comfort. He found a brutal, honest beauty in this existence, a raw purity that transcended the fleeting desires of the world below. This chosen path, however, was not merely a preference for solitude, but a consequence. For beneath that stoic facade, a deep river of resignation flowed, fed by the unshakable belief that his lineage was destined to end with him. This bitter certainty had not just led him to the lonely solace of his cabin, a sanctuary he had hewn from logs and stone with his own calloused hands, but had also forged within him an unyielding resolve. He found a peculiar strength in expecting nothing beyond the next sunrise, in trusting only what he could control. Hope, he had long decided, was a fragile, dangerous seed that could only sprout false dreams and invite crushing disappointment in a world that demanded resilience and self-reliance above all else. He was a man defined by absence, not desire, content with the harsh, clear truth of his solitary fate, his heart encased in ice yet surprisingly whole in its chosen emptiness. The conviction of his own barrenness was not born from idle speculation or mountain superstition, but from a weight pressed upon him by a specific diagnosis delivered by a lowland doctor years ago, a decree that had felt as final and unchangeable as the granite cliffs surrounding him. The memory of that day, sharp yet distant, was a wound that had healed into a scar, guiding his path ever since. It was a carefully delivered verdict, spoken with an authority that Elias, then younger and less hardened, had no reason to question. This judgment, reinforced by the passage of time and the complete lack of any other outcome, had sent him deeper into the mountains, a self-imposed exile where the perceived emptiness of his future could perfectly mirror the vast, empty landscapes he traversed. He had accepted it not with despair but with a grim, defiant resolve, allowing the untamed wild to consume any lingering whisper of an unmet paternal yearning. It was a part of his story, he believed, a fundamental, unchangeable flaw in his otherwise unyielding nature, a silent covenant made with the mountain that claimed him as its own. As the vibrant hues of autumn bled into a furious early winter, the mountains braced themselves for their harshest embrace. A storm, unlike any Elias had witnessed in years, began to gather, not merely a squall, but a malevolent force intent on reshaping the very landscape. The sky turned a bruised, ominous purple, the air growing thick and heavy with a static charge that presaged a true test of survival. The wind began its mournful, escalating howl, carrying the first, biting flakes of snow, swirling and dancing in a prelude to chaos. Elias moved with practiced efficiency, securing his cabin, checking the traps and woodpile, the familiar rituals offering a thin, temporary semblance of control against the looming maelstrom. The thought of any living soul caught outside in such a tempest was chilling, a vulnerability he rarely considered beyond the resilience of the local wildlife. But as the blizzard intensified, transforming his world into a maelstrom of blinding white and roaring wind, a faint, almost imperceptible shadow flickered at the very edge of his vision. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, swallowed instantly by the swirling snow, yet undeniably there, a fragile anomaly against the overwhelming fury of nature. Something, or someone, was out in the merciless cold, a spark of life trembling on the very threshold of his meticulously crafted solitude, a harbinger of change he could not yet comprehend. The blizzard roared, a predatory beast throwing its full weight against the sturdy walls of Elias Kalen's cabin. Snow, driven by a gale that shrieked like a banshee, piled against the windows, blurring the world into an impenetrable white. Yet the image of that fleeting shadow persisted in Elias's mind, an unwelcome intruder in the fortress of his solitude. He dismissed it at first, a trick of the swirling flakes, a fragment of imagination conjured by the storm's primal ferocity. But then, a sound, faint yet distinct, cut through the wind's endless lament, a low moan, not of the wind, but of something alive, something suffering. It was a sound that pierced the hardened shell of his self-imposed isolation, a raw, undeniable plea for succor. His heart, usually a steady drumbeat against the wild's rhythm, faltered for a fraction of a second. Against every instinct that had kept him alive and alone in these brutal peaks, he unbarred the heavy door, a sliver of candlelight pushing back against the encroaching darkness. The wind immediately tore at him, a physical blow, coating his face in ice crystals. His eyes, accustomed to discerning the smallest movement in the vast wilderness, strained against the whiteout, and there it was, huddled by the massive logs of his cabin, a figure barely visible beneath a tattered, snow-laden cloak. It was a woman, frail and almost entirely consumed by the drifts, her form barely distinguishable from the mounds of snow that threatened to become her final resting place. Her face, when he finally knelt beside her, was a mask of blue-tinged skin, her lips cracked, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a desperate, haunted plea. The air around her smelled not just of the biting cold, but of damp, fear-soaked wool and the faint, sweet scent of frostbitten skin. Her small frame trembled uncontrollably, a fragile leaf in a hurricane, utterly at the mercy of the elements. A profound internal battle raged within Elias. His wilderness training screamed caution, warned against the weakness of sentiment, against bringing the complexities of the lowland world into his perfectly ordered existence. He was a lone wolf, and wolves did not share their dens. Yet something in the sheer, unadulterated vulnerability of the woman stirred a deeper, more ancient code within him. It was a duty, perhaps, etched into the very fabric of mountain life, a grim, unwritten law that decreed no living soul should be left to perish on one's doorstep, not when shelter could be offered. The storm outside seemed to reflect his own internal tempest, the raw wind mirroring the chaos she had brought to his solitude. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that to leave her was to condemn her, and to bring her in was to invite an unknown future into a life he had meticulously shielded from change. His breath hitched, a plume of white in the frigid air, as the weight of the decision settled upon him. He reached out a hand, calloused and strong, to lift her. Her touch, fragile and ice-cold, felt like a tremor against the unyielding stone of his existence. He carried her into the cabin, the immense weight of the storm pushing against him as he quickly resecured the door, the immediate warmth of the crackling fire. The earthy scent of pine smoke and roasting venison must have been a shock to her frozen senses. He laid her gently near the hearth, peeling back the sodden layers of her cloak and dress with gruff, yet surprisingly careful hands. Her features, though gaunt and pale, hinted at a delicate beauty. As he worked to dry her hair and wrap her in a thick bear pelt, his gaze fell upon a small, intricate embroidery on the cuff of her dress, almost hidden by grime and wear. It was a tiny, faded depiction of a blooming rose, far too refined for the simple attire of a frontierswoman. It hinted at a past far removed from the harsh realities of mountain life, a life of softness and perhaps even privilege, now brutally stripped away. This woman, it became clear, was not merely lost. She was a refugee from a world that had not only abandoned her, but had actively sought to destroy the very delicate beauty her presence now suggested. Her ordeal had been more than just a struggle against the elements. It had been a flight from a malevolent force, a subtle wound not yet fully revealed. When she was finally warm enough to speak, her voice was a mere whisper, thin as the mountain air after a deep frost. She introduced herself as Elias, a widow, fleeing from an unscrupulous relative who sought to claim her meager inheritance, and perhaps more. Elias listened, his face an unreadable mask, yet a shift had occurred within him. The initial shock and discomfort of her presence slowly began to give way to a different, more complex understanding. Her desperation was palpable, her story a familiar echo of the greed and cruelty that sometimes tainted the world beyond the peaks. He knew the type of man she described, the kind who preyed on the vulnerable, twisting law and custom to their own advantage. He had seen such men briefly in the distant towns, and found them more repulsive than any wild beast. Here, in his solitary sanctuary, she was utterly defenseless, a lamb thrust into a wolf's den, yet he was no wolf to prey on her. He was, for this moment, her unlikely protector. His decision, once made, was absolute. He would offer her shelter for as long as the winter held them captive. But it would be a shelter of stark necessity, devoid of sentiment, a purely practical arrangement. He was Elias Kalen, the mountain man, creature of logic and survival, not of tender mercies. Yet, as he watched her drift into a fitful sleep, her chest rising and falling beneath the rough bear pelt, a profound and unsettling realization dawned upon him. The threshold he had crossed was not just the physical one of his cabin door. By inviting her in, by taking responsibility for this fragile, wounded soul, he had stepped irrevocably beyond the bounds of his carefully constructed solitude. His world, once a perfectly balanced equation of self-sufficiency and stoicism, had been breached. The mountain man, the sterile anchor of his own barren fate, had opened his door to a mystery, and as the storm outside slowly began to wane, a new, unforeseen tempest began to brew within the silent depths of his own heart. Elias awoke to the gentle crackle of the fire, its warmth a stark contrast to the icy terror that had gripped her mere hours before. The cabin, though rustic, radiated a quiet strength, a haven carved from the raw heart of the wilderness. Sunlight, pale and diffused, filtered through the small, greased paper windows, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air. The scent of wood smoke, strong coffee, and simmering game filled the space, a primal comfort that promised sustenance and safety. Her eyes, still heavy with exhaustion, slowly took in her surroundings. Rough-hewn log walls meticulously chinked with clay and moss, a sturdy table laden with simple hand-carved utensils, shelves lined with dried herbs and animal hides. This was not merely a shelter, it was a testament to a life lived deliberately, a fortress against the untamed world outside. Then she saw him. Elias Kalen, the mountain man, sat by the fire, sharpening a hunting knife with a methodical, almost meditative rhythm. His broad shoulders filled the doorway of his world, a silent, imposing figure. His gaze, when it met hers, was direct and unyielding, like the ancient stone of the peaks, but devoid of malice. In his presence, she felt a strange mix of profound relief and an equally profound apprehension. He was her savior, undeniably, but he was also an enigma, a man forged by the solitude of the wilderness, whose intentions were as unreadable as the mountain mists. He offered her a steaming mug of coffee and a bowl of thick stew, his movements economical, his silence unbroken save for the occasional hiss of the sharpening stone. It was a wordless invitation, an unspoken agreement that for now, the unspoken rules of survival would govern their interaction. Her gratitude was immense, a silent torrent threatening to overwhelm her. Yet she understood instinctively that effusive thanks would feel out of place in this stark, honest world. Instead, she ate, slowly at first, then with the desperate hunger of one who had faced starvation. As she finished, Elias finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, surprisingly gentle despite its gravelly tone. He explained the conditions of her stay. She was welcome to shelter until the worst of winter had passed, but in return, she would contribute. The mountain, he conveyed, demanded work from all who sought its embrace. It was not an offer of charity, but a proposition of shared labor, a direct challenge to her resilience. The arrangement, he made clear, was one of practical necessity, not of sentiment. He offered a sanctuary, not comfort, a place of safety in exchange for usefulness and respect for the unforgiving laws of that wild, secluded existence. Elias listened, her gaze sweeping over the cabin's interior, noting the careful order, the tools hung with purpose, the very air imbued with the discipline of a life rigorously lived. Her eyes fell upon a corner of the cabin, almost entirely obscured by a stack of firewood. There, she glimpsed a crude, hand-carved wooden bird, remarkably detailed, perched atop a small, smooth stone. It seemed out of place in this austere domain, a touch of delicate artistry amidst the raw functionality, almost as if it had been forgotten or left behind. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, yet it spoke of a hidden tenderness, a past touch of grace that seemed at odds with the hardened man before her. A flicker of intuition stirred within her. This man, whose silence was as vast as the wilderness he inhabited, held secrets that perhaps even he had chosen to bury deep beneath the snows of his own making. The day wore on, marked by the steady rhythm of Elias's chores. He chopped wood, mended a trap, his movements strong and deliberate. Eliza, still recovering, watched him, observing the quiet mastery with which he moved through his world. She felt the chill of the mountain even inside the cabin, the constant battle against the cold and ever-present reminder of their isolation. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in hues of deep violet and fading orange, Elias rose, his shadow stretching long across the cabin floor. He turned to her, his expression as unreadable as ever. The unspoken question hung in the air. What would be her contribution? What value could she, a city woman, bring to this world of rugged survival? The silence of the mountain pressed in, vast and expectant. Elias offered her a small, well-used axe, its handle worn smooth with countless hours of labor, and gestured towards a pile of smaller logs near the hearth. He then turned, taking up his rifle, and spoke of checking a trap line further up the ridge. It was a clear, unspoken message. Her path in this new world began now, with work. She was to make herself useful, or the mountain in its quiet way would reject her. The axe felt heavy in her hand, a tool of this new demanding life. As he stepped out into the gathering twilight, his imposing figure silhouetted against the last glow of the setting sun, Eliza understood. Her stay was contingent on her ability to adapt, to prove her worth to a man who measured value not in words or sentiment, but in action and resilience. Her sanctuary was not a gift, but a trust, a fragile arrangement in the heart of the wild. The first few days were a brutal test of Eliza's resolve. The rhythm of Elias's life was unforgiving, dictated by the relentless demands of the mountain. He moved with a practiced ease, his body a well-honed instrument against the elements, while Eliza, accustomed to the relative comforts of a town life, struggled. Her hands, once delicate, quickly grew raw and blistered from the unaccustomed labor of splitting firewood, hauling water from the frozen stream, and preparing meals over the open hearth. The rough-hewn tools felt alien in her grasp, and the biting cold seemed to seep into her very bones. Yet she persevered. Each swing of the axe, each numb finger warming by the fire, was a small victory against the vastness of her despair and the daunting challenge of her new existence. Elias observed her with the same detached intensity he reserved for tracking a wary animal. He offered no words of encouragement, no overt praise, but his gaze, though stoic, registered her efforts. He saw the tremble in her arms as she carried heavy buckets, the grim set of her jaw as she wrestled with a stubborn log. And he saw something more, a quiet, unyielding determination that belied her frail appearance. What he did not see, what he could not yet perceive, was how her quiet persistence began to subtly shift the atmosphere within his cabin. The scent of pine and smoke now mingled with the delicate fragrance of herbs she dried above the fire, a touch of healing warmth. Her presence, once an unsettling intrusion, began to weave itself into the fabric of his solitary world. One bitterly cold morning, Elias returned from his trap lines with a deep gash on his arm, a grim trophy from an encounter with a cornered wolverine. He rarely showed pain, but the wound was deep and angry, threatening infection. He moved with a stiffness, his usual agility hampered. Eliza, seeing the grim set of his mouth and the blood staining his sleeve, acted without hesitation. She fetched the medicinal herbs she recognized from her grandmother's teachings, boiling water and cleaning the wound with a steady hand that surprised even herself. She expertly bound it with strips of clean linen, her touch gentle but firm. Elias watched her, a flicker of something akin to surprise in his eyes. He had expected to tend to himself, as he always had. Her actions were a quiet assertion, a demonstration of competence that transcended physical strength. The cabin, once a mere shelter for survival, began to transform under her subtle influence. It was in the details. A clean, neatly folded blanket, a steaming cup of herbal tea offered at the end of a long, arduous day, a quiet order brought to the rough simplicity. Slowly, painstakingly, the cabin shed its austere utility and began to feel less like a den and more like a home. Her most unexpected contribution, however, was not in mending or cooking, but in her stories. In the long, dark evenings, as the wind howled outside, she would speak, softly at first, of the world beyond the mountains, of the bustling marketplace, of the subtle colors of a silk ribbon, of old songs and forgotten tales. Elias, at first, merely listened, his face impassive. But as the nights grew longer, and the silence began to press in with an almost physical weight, he found himself drawn into her narratives. Her voice, gentle and melodic, painted pictures of a life he had consciously abandoned, a life he had dismissed as weak and frivolous. Yet in her telling, he found a richness he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, she began to hum a lullaby, a melody from her childhood, sweet and sorrowful. Elias, usually so unmovable, felt a strange, unfamiliar ache in his chest, a memory stirring of a forgotten softness. The song resonated with a hidden chamber of his heart, a place long locked away. Their fragile understanding, however, was brutally interrupted. Just as a tentative rhythm of shared existence began to settle between them, a chilling sign appeared on the edge of Elias's territory. He returned one evening, his jaw set, a small, crudely carved wooden effigy in his hand. It was a familiar symbol of ill will from the lowland towns, a warning, a threat. It had been left conspicuously, half buried in the fresh snow near one of his less-used game trails, a clear message that his secluded world was no longer inviolable. Someone knew he was there, someone knew of his reclusive sanctuary, and someone sought to disrupt it. The presence of such a token, a deliberate act of malice, suggested an outside force was not merely encroaching, but actively seeking to provoke. Elias's eyes, usually so calm and discerning, now held a dangerous glint, the quiet menace of a cornered predator. The peace they had tentatively built was shattered, and an unseen shadow stretched its tendrils towards their mountain haven, a challenge thrown down, threatening to engulf all that Eliza had so painstakingly helped to create. The discovery of the crude effigy cast a long, chilling shadow over the cabin. Elias moved with a heightened alertness, his senses attuned to every whisper of the wind, every snap of a twig. The precarious peace they had nurtured was shattered, replaced by an unspoken tension. Eliza, though frightened, refused to crumble. She watched Elias, observing his methods, learning the subtle cues of his mountain wisdom. Her own fear transformed into a quiet resolve, a fierce protectiveness for the fragile sanctuary they had built together. The effigy was a stark reminder that her past, the very threat she had fled, was now closing in, threatening to consume not just her, but the solitary man who had taken her in. One frigid afternoon, as a thick fog descended, swallowing the cabin in a gray, silent shroud, a piercing cry echoed from the forest. It was the distinct call of a lynx, not the casual sound of a hunt, but a desperate shriek of pain. Elias, who had been chopping wood near the cabin, froze. He knew that sound. It was the lynx that often roamed the higher ridges, a formidable creature he respected. and one he knew to be heavily pregnant. The distress in its cry indicated something gravely wrong. Without a word, he grabbed his rifle and headed into the swirling mist, leaving Eliza alone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and growing understanding. Hours later, the fog still thick and the light fading fast, Elias had not returned. Eliza's anxiety mounted with each passing moment. She remembered the direction he had taken, an instinct guiding her. Grabbing a thick lantern and her small, newly acquired axe, she stepped out into the oppressive silence, her footsteps muffled by the gathering snow. Her breath plumed in the cold air, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She called out his name, her voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. Following faint tracks, she found him by a steep, ice-slicked ravine. The lynx, caught in a makeshift snare, was thrashing wildly, its leg badly mangled, its eyes wild with pain and fear. Elias, attempting to free it, had slipped on the ice, his leg twisted beneath a fallen log, pinning him. He was trapped, injured, and rapidly succumbing to the cold. The heavy smell of pine needles, wet earth, and something metallic, something like blood, hung in the frigid air around them. Fear gave way to a surge of adrenaline. Eliza knew she had to act quickly. Elias, gritting his teeth against the pain, barked instructions, his voice strained. He needed the lynx freed first, lest it die or attack them both. Drawing upon an inner strength she hadn't known she possessed, Eliza, despite her revulsion for the struggling animal, used the small axe to cut away the ropes of the snare. The lynx, once freed, snarled in pain, but, sensing her intent, did not strike. Its eyes, though still wild, held a strange, ancient understanding. Then, with a ferocity born of desperation, Eliza worked to free Elias. The log was heavy, but the axe, once an unfamiliar burden, now felt like an extension of her will. She dug, she leveraged, she pushed, her muscles screaming with effort. Finally, with a guttural cry, she managed to shift the log just enough for Elias to pull his leg free, his face pale with pain and exertion. He winced, but the gratitude in his eyes was unmistakable, a raw, powerful emotion that shattered the walls of his usual stoicism. As they stumbled back to the cabin, supporting each other, the lynx surprisingly followed at a distance, a silent, furry shadow. Back inside, by the firelight, Elias tended to his own leg, the injury significant but not broken. Eliza, her hands still trembling, applied a poultice to the lynx's leg, which had limped into the cabin and now lay panting by the hearth, its fierce eyes softened by exhaustion and an unspoken trust. The immediate crisis was past, the tension broken. The mountain man and the city widow, united by the shared ordeal, sat in the flickering firelight, the injured lynx their silent witness. Elias, his voice rough with emotion, spoke of his own past. He revealed the crushing diagnosis of barrenness, the reason for his self-imposed exile, the heavy burden he had carried. He spoke of a proud father who had wished for a different kind of heir, a lowland match, and the perceived shame of his son's perceived inability to provide one. Eliza, in turn, confessed her own profound grief, the loss of her husband, the betrayal of her family, the utter loneliness that had driven her to the mountains. Their shocking truth was not an external revelation, but the baring of their most profound vulnerabilities, the quiet shedding of the protective layers that had kept them isolated. In that moment, by the warmth of the fire, a new truth took root. They were two outcasts, bound by shared sorrow and newfound mutual respect. The lynx, a creature of the wild, watched them with ancient eyes, its head resting on its paws. The shared silence was no longer empty, but filled with a profound understanding, a deep, resonant connection that transcended words. Elias, looking at Eliza, truly saw her then, not as a burden or a temporary guest, but as an integral part of his world, a woman whose quiet strength had saved him. Her presence had not weakened him, as he had once feared, but had revealed a strength within him he had almost forgotten. As the lynx let out a soft, contented purr, a new sound in the austere cabin, Elias realized that his life, once defined by absence, was now being slowly, miraculously, filled. But just as this profound connection solidified, A new, unsettling thought struck him. The effigy, the unspoken threat. He had been so focused on saving the lynx in himself that he had forgotten the immediate danger looming from the outside world. He looked at Eliza, her face serene in the firelight, and a cold dread settled in his gut. His gratitude was immense, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce primal terror, the thought of losing her, losing this unexpected, fragile connection that had just begun to bloom. He had something to lose, and that made him vulnerable in a way he had never been before. The days that followed the ravine incident settled into a rhythm of quiet healing and growing intimacy. Elias's injured leg mended slowly, and Eliza's steady hands, guided by her knowledge of herbs and the mountain's bounty, proved indispensable. The lynx, whom Elias named Shadow, recovered alongside him, a silent, watchful presence, an unexpected member of their nascent family. The cabin, once a solitary bastion, now hummed with a different kind of life. Elias and Eliza moved around each other with an unspoken grace, their tasks intertwined. They collected firewood, cooked meals, and mended tools together, their hands often brushing, their eyes meeting in moments of shared understanding. The air, once thick with Elias's self-imposed isolation, now carried the subtle fragrance of Eliza's drying herbs, the sound of her humming, and the soft rustle of her movements. In the long evenings by the warmth of the roaring fire, the vulnerability they had shared in the aftermath of the accident deepened into a profound connection. Elias, his gruff exterior softened by his injury, and Eliza's quiet strength, began to speak more freely. He told her stories of his youth, of the mountains before the trappers came, of his father's distant affection, and the harsh lessons of survival. Eliza, in turn, shared tales of her own, of a childhood spent in a small, bustling town, of the books she loved, and the gentle memories of her late husband. Their conversations were not just words exchanged, but threads woven, binding their disparate pasts into a shared present. They discovered a mutual love for the stark beauty of the mountain sunsets, for the crisp, clean air after a snowfall, and for the quiet majesty of the ancient pines. Their connection deepened into a mature, respectful love, born not of youthful passion, but of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a quiet, profound understanding of each other's wounded souls. One night, as Eliza was mending a tear in Elias's worn deerskin vest, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns on the leather, she paused. Hidden within a small, almost invisible pocket sewn into the lining, she felt a small, smooth object. With Elias's unspoken permission, she pulled it out. It was a perfectly preserved, dried rosebud, identical to the faded embroidery on her own dress cuff. Elias's eyes, usually so guarded, softened with a distant memory. He explained it was a memento from his mother, a woman who had died when he was a boy, and who had carried a deep fondness for the delicate flowers. Her love for roses, he said, was one of the few gentle memories he held of his childhood, a stark contrast to his father's rugged practicality. The realization washed over Eliza with a quiet, astonishing force. Her own mother, she confessed, had adored roses, teaching her the very embroidery that adorned her dress, a skill passed down through generations. The small, dried rosebud and the embroidered cuff, seemingly insignificant details, now revealed an astonishing link between their two seemingly separate worlds, a delicate thread connecting their ancestries. It was as if destiny, in its own subtle way, had always intended their paths to converge, their lives intertwined by a shared, almost forgotten lineage, woven into the very fabric of their pasts. The newfound sense of belonging, the quiet joy of a shared life, filled the cabin like the warmth from the hearth. Eliza, once a refugee, now carried herself with a quiet confidence, her spirit blooming in the rugged soil of Elias's protection. She found joy in the simple routines, in the strength of Elias's arm, in the deep silence of the snow-laden peaks. Elias, in turn, discovered a tenderness he had long believed buried beneath layers of self-sufficiency. He learned to smile, a rare, genuine expression that transformed his stern face and his deep-set eyes, once filled with a solitary watchfulness, now held a newfound light. The mountain, once his solitary refuge, now felt like a shared home, a sanctuary for a family he had never thought to have. But the mountain, in its majestic indifference, was also a constant reminder of the world beyond. The peace, however profound, was always precarious. One crisp morning, as Elias stood outside surveying his trap lines, he noticed a subtle disturbance. Not a fresh track or a broken branch, but a carefully placed marker, a small cairn of stones on a distant ridge that was not part of the natural landscape. It was a sign, precise and deliberate, a signal used by trappers and scouts from the lowlands to mark a path, a boundary, or a target. It was the same crude symbol used by the men who sometimes ventured into the deeper mountains, men driven by greed or a lust for what others possessed. This cairn, planted in his territory, spoke of intrusion, of a deliberate intent to trespass. The tranquil morning air, once filled with the promise of a peaceful day, now carried a faint, unsettling echo of human footsteps. The serenity of their mountain haven was about to be shattered. Elias felt the familiar prickle of warning, a primal instinct that screamed danger. The relative calm had been merely a deceptive lull before the storm. Someone was coming. His grip tightened on his axe, his gaze hardening as he scanned the horizon, a fierce, protective instinct rising within him, like a great bear awakening from its winter slumber. The subtle cairn on the distant ridge was a festering wound in the fragile peace of Elias's world. He knew its meaning with chilling certainty, a deliberate encroachment, a path being marked. The days that followed were charged with an uneasy tension. Elias moved with a renewed vigilance, his senses sharpened, his rifle never far from his grasp. Eliza, observing his quiet intensity, understood the unspoken threat. Her heart, once filled with the warmth of their burgeoning connection, now beat with a frantic protectiveness. She was no longer just a refugee. She was a fierce defender of the home and the man who had given her sanctuary. The primary force of opposition, Eliza's greedy relative, had not forgotten her. Driven by a relentless lust for her meager inheritance, he had finally tracked her to Elias's mountain haven. He arrived with a small band of men from the nearest town, their faces hard, their intentions clear. They were not mountain men, but lowlanders, wary and suspicious, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and avarice. Their leader, a corpulent man with a cruel sneer, had inflamed them with tales of Elias's reclusive nature, painting him as a savage, a wild man who had taken Eliza against her will. Their objective was not merely to reclaim property, but to take Eliza from Elias, to sever the fragile new life she had built. For them, she was merely a prize, a chattel to be recovered. As the small group of men ascended the winding mountain path towards the cabin, their voices echoing through the crisp air, Elias braced himself. He saw them from a distance, their figures small against the towering peaks. But their intent was as clear as the winter sky. He was no longer just protecting his solitude. He was defending his nascent family, the future of the woman who had brought light into his barren world. He positioned himself strategically, his rifle held ready, his gaze scanning the approaches. The threat was not just to his home, but to the very essence of their connection. His protective instincts, once dormant, now roared to life, a primal force against the encroaching danger. But the approaching threat was more complex than it first appeared. Among the lowlanders, shadowed by the greed-driven men, was a figure Elias recognized, the town's undertaker, a man known for his quiet demeanor and his unnerving efficiency. Elias had heard rumors that the undertaker harbored a long-standing resentment against Eliza's avaricious relative, whispers of a past injustice, a debt unpaid. His presence was an unexpected variable, a silent, watchful shadow that hinted at a deeper, more personal vendetta. He carried no weapon, but his eyes held a cold, calculating gleam, suggesting an agenda far beyond simple bounty hunting. The main antagonist was not acting alone, and his seemingly simple quest for Eliza's inheritance was now complicated by an unexpected, internal struggle within his own ranks. The men finally reached the clearing outside the cabin, their boots crunching loudly on the snow. Elias's relative, his voice booming with false authority, demanded her surrender, accusing Elias of holding her captive. Elias stood firm, his imposing figure a silent wall of defiance, his rifle raised. Eliza, standing just behind him, her face pale but resolute, met her relative's gaze with a fierce defiance he had never witnessed before. The tension crackled in the air, thick and suffocating, on the precipice of violence. But before a shot could be fired, a new and devastating threat emerged. From the distant peaks, a deep, rumbling sound began, faint at first, then growing into a terrifying roar. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a primal tremor that shook the very foundations of the mountain. Snow, light and powdery at first, began to cascade from the higher slopes, gathering momentum, picking up speed. An avalanche, vast and merciless, was thundering down the mountain, directly towards their small clearing. It was an unexpected cataclysmic force, nature itself rising up against the petty squabbles of men. The lowlanders screamed in terror, scrambling to flee, but the path was quickly becoming impassable. Elias grabbed Eliza, pulling her close, his eyes scanning for any sliver of escape, any shelter against the imminent deluge of snow and ice. He knew the mountain. He knew its fury. In a desperate split-second decision to save Eliza and the fragile life they had built, to spare the innocent, he turned to the terrified men, his voice cutting through the roar of the avalanche. He pointed to a small, jagged rock overhang nearby, barely large enough for a few. "Go!" he bellowed, pushing Eliza towards it. He would draw the brunt of the avalanche, allowing them precious seconds to find whatever meager shelter they could, sacrificing himself, or at least his safety, to buy them time. The world dissolved into a blinding, deafening white, the roar of the avalanche a primal scream, and Elias, standing tall against the swirling chaos, knew he might never see the dawn again. His life, once so solitary, now felt tied to hers, a sacrifice he would make without a second thought. The mountain roared, a primal beast unleashing its full, terrifying might. The avalanche thundered down, a churning wall of snow, ice, and splintered trees, swallowing the entire clearing in a blinding, deafening maelstrom. It was a terrifying, indiscriminate force, a frozen judgment from the heavens. Eliza, pushed roughly into the meager shelter of the rock overhang by Elias, covered her head, her ears ringing with the colossal roar, the air thick with pulverized snow. She felt the ground vibrate violently, the very mountain shuddering under the immense pressure. A moment later, a profound, eerie silence descended, broken only by the settling whispers of displaced snow and the frantic, gasping breaths of those who had survived. When the snow settled, painting the world in a stark, pristine white, Elias was nowhere to be seen. Eliza, her heart seized with terror, emerged from the overhang, frantically calling his name. The other lowlanders, pale and shaken, slowly pulled themselves from their own meager shelters, coughing and sputtering in the frigid air. The greedy relative, Eliza's tormentor, was completely gone, swallowed by the snow, erased from the face of the mountain as if he had never existed. His men, traumatized and disoriented, simply stared at the blank white wall where the path had been, their lust for inheritance utterly vanquished by the raw power of nature. Suddenly, a muffled groan came from beneath a deep drift of snow near the cabin. Eliza, driven by a surge of desperate hope, began to dig frantically with her bare hands, her fingers numb with cold and fear. The undertaker, who had emerged largely unscathed, his face now grim and resolute, joined her, quickly clearing the heavy snow. Together they uncovered Elias, buried deep but alive, his body battered and bruised, but his eyes, though dazed, still burning with a fierce light. He had somehow managed to brace himself against a sturdy pine, its ancient trunk protecting him from the full force of the deluge, a testament to his ingrained knowledge of the mountain's temperament. The lynx, Shadow, emerged from a covered den beneath a thick bush, shaken but unharmed. its golden eyes fixed on Elias with an almost human concern. As Elias slowly came to, propped against a snowdrift, the undertaker, his voice surprisingly clear in the stunned silence, stepped forward. He had a story to tell, a truth he could no longer keep buried. He confessed to the remaining lowlanders, and to Eliza, that the diagnosis of Elias's sterility, delivered years ago by the town doctor, had been a deliberate deception. It was a lie orchestrated by Elias's own proud father, a powerful figure who had desired a more suitable match for his son, a woman of means and lineage, not the humble, simple country girl Elias had loved in his youth. The doctor, indebted to the elder Kalen, had reluctantly complied, fabricating the damning report. The truth, now laid bare amidst the devastation of the avalanche, hung in the frigid air. A shocking revelation that cast Elias's entire life of solitude in a new, tragic light. It was not a physical defect that had condemned him, but the cruel machinations of a misguided parental pride. The remaining lowlanders, who had been swayed by the relatives' lies, now stood in stunned silence, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock, shame, and awe. The greed and anger that had brought them to the mountain evaporated like mist in the morning sun, replaced by a profound respect for Elias and a newfound empathy for Eliza. The true villain, it became clear, was not Elias, the mountain man, but the deceit that had shaped his destiny and the avarice that had pursued Eliza. The confrontation, which had threatened to devolve into bloodshed, was resolved not by human conflict, but by the overwhelming justice of the mountain itself. The avalanche had not only swept away Eliza's tormentor, but had also cleared the path for a long-buried truth to emerge, revealing the moral compass that guided both Elias and Eliza. As the last echoes of the avalanche faded, and the mountain settled back into its stoic silence, a new question arose from the quiet. The immediate threat was gone, the injustice revealed, but the world remained a wild and dangerous place. The undertaker, having unburdened his conscience, silently turned and began the slow descent back towards the lowlands, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast white expanse. His departure left a small, lingering thread of realism, a reminder that not all dangers disappear with a single dramatic event. The mountain had delivered its judgment, but the future, always uncertain, lay ahead, waiting to be shaped by the resilience and newfound strength of Elias and Eliza. The quiet courage they had displayed, their unwavering trust in each other amidst the chaos, had not only saved them, but had forged an unbreakable bond, a silent promise of a future built on truth and love, whatever challenges the vast wilderness might still hold. 9 months later, the mountain cabin, once a fortress of solitude, hummed with a different kind of life. The deep scars of the avalanche had been softened by the returning spring, and the wilderness, in its eternal cycle, had begun to reclaim the disrupted earth. Elias, no longer the solitary mountain man, moved with a newfound grace, his movements infused with a quiet joy. His injured leg had healed completely, stronger than before, a testament to the mountain's enduring power and Eliza's gentle care. The crude effigy and the avaricious men were distant memories, mere shadows banished by the light that now filled their home. One crisp morning, as the first rays of dawn painted the peaks in hues of gold and rose, a scene of profound domestic peace unfolded. Elias sat by the hearth, meticulously carving a small wooden cradle from a block of fragrant pine, his calloused hands surprisingly delicate as they worked the wood. Eliza, her belly beautifully round with the promise of new life, sat nearby, mending a tiny garment, her humming a soft melody against the crackle of the fire. Shadow, the lynx, now a loyal, contented companion, dozed at their feet, its golden eyes occasionally fluttering open to observe the quiet activity. The cabin, once filled with the austere scent of pine and smoke, now carried the sweet aroma of baking bread, the delicate scent of dried lavender, and the undeniable presence of love. Elias was no longer merely a hunter. He was a husband, a protector, and soon a father. The sanctuary was no longer just a place of survival. It was a home, overflowing with warmth and belonging. Then, as the first spring flowers bloomed in the high meadows, the miracle arrived. Elias gave birth not to one child, but to two, a boy and a girl, twin blessings in the heart of the wild. The man who had believed himself barren, condemned to an airless existence, now held a son and a daughter in his arms, their tiny cries filling the cabin with a sound more beautiful than any mountain song. It was a complete unraveling of his deepest, most painful certainty, a joyous rebuttal to the lie that had shaped his life. He looked at Eliza, her face radiant with exhaustion and love, and a profound understanding washed over him. It was not the town doctor's decree, but the wild, untamed spirit of the mountain, combined with Eliza's indomitable heart, that held the ultimate truth. Their children, born in the very heart of the wilderness, were living testaments to a love that defied all odds, a bond forged in hardship and nurtured by an unexpected grace. The revelation of Elias's true fertility, though a deeply personal one, quickly wove itself into the lore of the scattered mountain communities. The undertaker, back in the lowlands, spoke of the truth, cleansing Elias's name and confirming the treachery of his father's past. Elias's father, upon hearing the full, tragic story of his deceit and its consequences, and faced with the reality of his son's unexpected progeny, was said to have retreated into a bitter, isolated silence, his pride finally broken by the undeniable truth. The story of the barren mountain man who found love and family, and through that love was blessed with not one, but two heirs, became a legend whispered around campfires, a tale of justice, redemption, and the unexpected power of the wild. It spoke of a place where true strength was not found in solitude, but in the courage to embrace connection, and where the deepest wounds could be healed by the most unexpected of blessings. Elias and Eliza remained in the mountains, their cabin a beacon of quiet contentment. Their children grew, strong and free, learning the ancient ways of the mountain from their father, and the gentle wisdom of nature from their mother. The mountain man, once a symbol of stoic isolation, had become the patriarch of a thriving, unexpected family. The barren peaks, once a reflection of his own perceived emptiness, now echoed with the laughter of his children, the warmth of his wife's embrace, and the quiet contentment of a life fully lived. The message was etched into every sunrise and every star-filled night. Solitude could offer a shield, but true strength, the kind that sustained and nourished, was found in the warmth of shared love. The greatest inheritance a man could leave was not gold or land, but the enduring legacy of family, the warmth of a home, and the unbreakable spirit forged in the heart of the wild. They were a testament to the truth that home was not merely a place on a map, but a feeling of profound belonging, a sanctuary built not with logs and stone alone, but with courage, resilience, and the unwavering light of a true love. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us from what corner of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel.